primarily about halacha. Most people were interested, and most people who lived from the 1st to the 6th centuries, let's say the Mishnaic Talmudic era, were concerned with the halachic process. The halachic process was the center of it all. And that is a 19th century Lithuanian prism through which you are supposed to see the rabbinic period. Yes, there's a great deal of halachic discourse, and the halachic discourse is very rich. But there were lots of people, and lots of very smart and interesting people in 3rd century Eretz Yisrael or 5th century Bavel, who were reading the text primarily al derech ha'agadah. They were baalei agadah alongside baalei halacha. And there are some people who we have who are only halachists, and there are some people we have traditions from who were only or mostly agadists. These were overlapping circles to some extent. Some people engage in both. You have a Rabbi Akiva who's a gadol in both, and many others. But there are people for whom the process was really an agadic process. We have other circles of Jews in the early centuries who read the Torah primarily al derech hashemot, who were interested in what we would now call the magical side of it, how you read the Torah looking for names of God and backwards readings and gematria readings and so on. That was also there, more than we admit, because it was edited out. The later editors who selected what was going to be canonical selected halacha over everything else, and then agadah. The wonderful literature of Aliyah Merkava, of Hechalot, mysticism, was outcast and survived only in fragments and bits and pieces of text that were only printed for the first time in the 19th and 20th centuries. We don't know how many Olim LaMerkava there were as compared to how many Oskim B'Halacha there were. We have no demographical figures on that. Was this a parallel circle? Was this, again, an overlapping circle? Was this only a kind of how do you say shuli in English?
Marginal.
Marginal, thank you. Was this only a marginal phenomenon of a few odd nuts? Or if you look at the Qumran circle, and you look at the people who wrote the apocryphal literature that was coming out in the 1st century, the Sifrei Chanoch and so on, and you look at the Merkava people, and you look at the very wide circles of Greek-speaking Jews in the diaspora, who eventually turned to Christianity because they didn't somehow find a place in emerging rabbinic Judaism, the emerging consensus of rabbinic Judaism. How wide was this? How wide was this Jewish spectrum, and how narrow the filter through which it was later selected? So I say that because when you think midrashically, and you look at some of these odder seeming midrashim, like the coronation of God, or the Gibor al Hayam that you read to the pieces of my university, or were these kind of marginal nutcase midrashim, and should they just, is this mainstream Judaism, quote unquote? Mainstream Judaism, remember, a new term created in the early 19th century, which has no precedent in the tradition, created primarily to serve the interests of assimilating, westernizing Jews and protect them from anything they considered embarrassing. So anything like this would be read out of the tradition. That's not mainstream because it's too embarrassing. It doesn't sound Kantian enough. It doesn't sound normative Judaism as a monotheistic, pure, abstract God ethical system. Isn't that what Judaism is? Those essentialist views of Judaism created by this notion of mainstream have really choked a lot of the creative energy out of Jewish life, because so much of it was put down in favor of a certain, well, this is what you're supposed to believe, this is what Judaism believes, this is what Judaism really is. And there's so much more in the tradition to be resurrected and for us to discover, maybe this is something I want to play with. Maybe this is a metaphor that will work for a feminist age. Maybe this is a metaphor that will work for a new kind of constructing Judaism. So when I talk about this young God tradition, the God of the sea, the children of the sea tradition, what I'm really suggesting, in a very broad sense, is that tradition has to go alongside the Midrash Shir HaShirim tradition. That God as lover was cut out of the tradition. we were left with God as Father and God as King as the primary metaphors for understanding God in personified terms. But there was a very rich God as lover tradition that was essentially buried or became the exclusive inheritance of Kabbalists and poets. Yes, you see it in Shirat Yemei Beinaim, and you see it in Kabbalah, of course. But then but it wasn't, quote, mainstream Judaism, and certainly not. Those texts weren't translated into Yiddish, for example, where women might read them, God forbid, or where ordinary people might read them who didn't have the Hebrew. And they certainly weren't presented to us Westerners. But I'm saying now, if we're thinking about a new religious language for the love of God and for relationship, you have written a magnificent commentary on Shir HaShirim, which I think is one of Professor Fishbane's greatest works. Well, the question of how we reintroduce Eros into our religious lives in a way that works, does not cheapen in any way, but enriches. That's one of the great challenges, I think, for a serious Jewish religious life today. And so I throw these kinds of midrashic fantasy texts out to you. Fantasy is not a dirty word for me. I think fantasy is fine. It's a very important place in religious life. So I throw these out to you as a sense of, well, these are pieces of Judaism we might think about picking up. I remember I say somewhere in Radical Judaism you will find it's so important to me that the essential curriculum of Jewish childhood in the old Cheder was Chumash and Rashi. It was always Chumash and Rashi. It was never just Chumash. Which is to say there was always a commentary that transformed the meaning, that Rashi was a prism through which you saw the Torah. And I don't think our prism is going to be Rashi's prism. He was, after all, an 11th century French commentator. But the idea that you have a Chumash, and then you have the Perush, then you have a way of reading it, a way of rereading it. When you see how radically Rashi, even though he says, I only care about Pshuto Shel Mikra, you see how radically he rereads, that gives you a license to do some of the same thing, to engage and to be a Rashi for the people you teach and the people you're bringing it to. So I think that's important. I liked what you said. I don't quite usually think of it this way. That Pshat is to the Yachid what Drash is to the Tzibur. That when we go from Pshat to Drash, we are thinking more collectively, this is how the Jewish people sees it. In some ways I like that, in some ways I want to think about that. I'm not
I think it goes a little bit against part of Rashi, but it's...
Yeah, I'm not quite on the dotted line with that one, because I want the Drash to be able to be varied in so many individualistic ways, and for each poetic spirit to be able to do Drash. So I don't want to limit Drash to this is what the Jewish people says. That's what I'm saying. I want to expand Drash in more varied ways, perhaps. I think that's most of what I wanted to say for right now. So let's throw it open to you.
Yeah, come in wherever you want in terms of the readings, in terms of your response to this discourse, where you are at.
I'm curious about why has Jewish tradition been so receptive to Midrash, and are we different from other religious traditions in this way? I noticed that what I love about Judaism is that we can expand to be able to change for what people need, and to be able to include people who would maybe traditionally feel excluded from our faith. We've been able to allow people to stay in the tradition because of our way of interpreting and being able to expand meaning. I'm curious why is Judaism kind of receptive?
Well, I got a couple things to say about it.
Yeah, well, I think just to get the conversation started, I think that one of the cultural factors is the closing of the canon. So when you say that these are Kitvei Kodesh, this is the boundary, how do you open up the tradition? You have to open it up from within. In other words, if you're saying I can't bring in new texts from the outside, everything has to be regenerated from within. That means you're reading Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and fragments, and you're creating a very thick intertextual series of correlations. In other words, Scripture is commenting on Scripture, or words are illuminating words, or two words will illuminate themselves for something else. So the first thing is like, how does that midrashic process arise? On the one hand, of course, it arises to fill in gaps. But I think its true creativity, even at the halachic level, is not just gap filling or resolving contradictions, which is simply a part of the standard Beit Midrash style to make sure you at least know what you're talking about. But it's how does the culture unfold when there are certain authoritative boundaries to what can enter in. So in a certain sense, everything flowers from inside outward, and it creates all kinds of new prismatic possibilities from the inside. That's at least one way to get that conversation started. In other words, to use it, kind of to talk more formally, literarily, but of course it's affected by the spiritual imagination. It's Bagbag's phrase, kulabe. Everything is there, but it has to be remolded, refashioned, brought into new kind of conjunctions, because God's infinite voice is stabilized at one level, and in a sense what the oral tradition is to return us to the living God. What you, Divrei Elohim Chaim, in your beautiful commentary on the prayer, which Chabad talks about, that commentary is Divrei Elohim Chaim. So in a sense, the Torah also remains Divrei Elohim Chaim, and it's returning the original voice back to voice.
So I was very influenced by and loved an article I read many years ago by a scholar, Christian scholar of rabbinics named W.D. Davies. A little article called Torah and Dogma. Torah and Dogma.
Uh-huh.
He said the following: the rabbinic community was defined largely by praxis. You knew who was in the rabbinic community and who was out by how they practiced and by the halachic norms. That wonderful moment where Rabbi Meir and Acher are walking outside the edge of town after Acher has left, and they're talking Torah, and then they get to the Tchum Shabbat, and Acher says to Meir, Chazor Becha, go back, because this is the Tchum Shabbat. And Meir says, Afata Chazor Becha, meaning you too return. And Meir goes back, and Acher walks off. That's the boundary of the rabbinic community. He said, because we had that, we didn't have to define ourselves dogmatically. You could say a lot of different things in Agadah, and Agadah was free because you were defined by normative praxis. The church did not have that, and therefore defined itself by dogma. And the various church councils, the Nicene, the various creeds that came out of the councils, were to weed out the heretics, especially the Gnostics, and to define what was proper Christian faith. The word orthodoxy is the word that comes from Christianity. It was the proper faith. It was the proper faith that was defined by the church, and the church kept control of how you understood the Bible. So that freedom to create for everybody, I mean, it was there for, Gedolei HaKnesiah, of course, great church fathers could do it, and there are lots of very rich readings of Scripture. There's lots of midrash in Origen and Augustine and the early church fathers, but it was very much controlled by authority, especially in the Catholic Church. Your understanding of Scripture was what the church said it meant, and there was a single, eventually dominant, dogmatic view of what Scripture said. The Protestants tried to recover it, but they too got caught up in this question of fundamentalism. Even our dear friends from ANTS, when we co-taught courses, when Orr and Greg co-taught courses here, the ANTS students were always shocked by the way we could play with Scripture, by the freedom, the midrashic freedom we had to read the Bible. They had never seen anything like that. It is something that is, I wouldn't say entirely unique, but is certainly very characteristic of Judaism. The way of preserving scriptural text through great freedom of interpretation is very characteristically Jewish. When I look at what's going on in Islam today, Islam, of course, also had great traditions of interpretation. And in the Middle Ages, I would say there was lots of freedom to be creative with the text. But that got shut down in pre-modern times, probably because of the cultural decline of Islam altogether, and then the Wahhabi revolution and so on. So you see these people who are trying to do things because that's the way it was done in the 7th century. We're going to slaughter all the Yazidis because Muhammad didn't only said people of the book have to be preserved, but people who don't have of non-biblical faith can all be slaughtered if they won't convert. It was just a shock that people are trying to live again in the 7th century. You know, we would have said, well, you know, the Zion Amamin, the 7 peoples of Canaan have no longer exist since so-and-so. We have a midrashic justification of it, you know, and it's changed, and we were able to wipe those horrible parts of the Torah away from praxis because of midrashic process, lo hayav v'lo nivra, you know, things like that. There never was a ben sorer or moreh, it was only a mashal, you know, so we were able to save ourselves from the worst of the primitive era in which scripture was written, if I can say that, by the midrashic process. It didn't work as well in Islam. I'm not saying that it's not there. That is there in Islam, but somehow the Islamic faithful did not go along with that process as well, and it wasn't canonized as well as it was in Judaism. So that is when I ask in the current new dialogue of world religions, what does Judaism have to offer? One of the things I think we have to offer is that relationship to sacred scripture, of great reverence and love and creativity at the same time. Yeah.
Misha?
Can I also try to
Please.
take a stab at that question? I think that since we don't really have a personal God, we don't have a Jesus, or we don't have the many gods of Hinduism, that we grope to create these personal connections. So since we don't have a Jesus or a Vishnu, we create a Moses that seems more relatable. So the tongue, or an Abraham that comes out of the fire of Nimrod. So these figures become so much more relatable because our spiritual exemplars are so abstract and distant. And so I think part of that midrashic process is creating people that are more ours.
And that is myth. Those become mythic figures for us. Yeah, I think that's.
I'm trying to think how best to formulate it, but in both of your speaking, there's this gap between two different kinds of language relating to Midrash. One in which there's really this almost like melding or fusion between the darshan and the text, and in the other where there's this radical separation. Language like the Dolesh isn't even reading the text, only reading the words, or the darshan is saving the text. If midrash is to be almost an engine inside of our religious expression, and if the whole project is based on a reverence for the text, otherwise why even start there? I'd like to ask you both if there's a way to articulate. I mean, I'm trying to think of my own, but a way to articulate the relationship between the darshan and the text that isn't leaning too far toward negating either. Or when you talk about it's a mutual relationship, I see that too. But then how do we actually talk about that relationship? Because when it comes to actual description, I see it leaning too far in one direction or the other.
So I think that let's start with the dialogical model. The Midrash says, Rabbi so-and-so Omer. Text speaks, right? It's a living voice. The person who encounters the text as midaber, Omer, etc., is also a person who comes with an internal texture that comes from the tradition, but that's also idiosyncratic and personal, right? Life experience textures the self, just the way the text textures the self. And then that personal inquiry finds images, forms, dynamics that are both in the text but perceived by the loving inquirer. So I think that this is a dialogical interrelationship that of one ze leze omer, right? Each one is speaking to the other and enriching the other. We're talking about Midrash Agadah particularly. And that discourse is a continuous discourse. It's a vishinantam, right? From one generation to the other, my experience, your experience. We put together in Midrashic anthologies a series of Devar Acher, so that you become aware that there are multiple voices or multiple personal ways in which that can be seen. The collections of Midrash are showing you how you can live midrashically within a very, very broad spectrum. How do you do Judaism? How do you do it? It's exemplifying. It's a model. I think that your concern about boundaries are too much. Let's leave aside the halachic issue, but you even have alternate opinions, right? There's a Yesh Omrim tradition that's very powerful. I think that what's happened is, or at least to speak more personally, I think that you choose to live within a community that shares a certain elasticity of understanding. Let's just leave it to the Midrash Agadah at this point. In other words, obviously, you can go too far out and you can be too constricted. I think that the people that you pray with and the people that you live with, that you study with, you gain a certain kind of inner feel for what's a legitimate way for your religious life to flourish. And you don't just do so in the level of ideas, you see, how do I put it into practice? How do I put a midrashic idea into interpersonal relationship, leaving aside the halachic boundaries, right? That I'm expressing my Jewish values, or this issue of, is it, derech eretz kadma Torah? I can bring that in because now I can talk it in a Jewish way. I can give it a Jewish vocabulary. So I think that the question is real, but if you think about midrashic experience as a dialogical experience, where the text and the person's life are interpenetrating, and then you go back out into a community. Your first encounter is not just yourself, it might be your chavrusa. That would be that first communal boundary of what are the borders, what can we really talk about, right? Intimately or socially, or where do we want to go with that? So a chavrusa is extremely important in that regard, because a chavrusa is your first community of shared interpretation. So it's not just an idiosyncratic play, right? It's being tested out with a friend, one that you care to live with, and share a personal thought in the midst of a halachic thought, right? And then you begin to see what is the play of that. So I don't think there's a final answer, although there is obviously attempts by the tradition to give you networks of possibility. The very fact that you have these anthologies are giving you networks of possibility. But that's only the means to kind of play further. You see, so I would start. Does that make sense to you, or how do you feel about that?
Well, I wasn't looking at the issue of communal boundaries. I was really looking at the relationship between
did I say that doesn't answer that?
The question of what's permissible to think within the community or within the tradition, and the relationship with the Chavruta, those are important issues, but I'm looking specifically at the frame of reader and text, and especially when we're looking at what Midrash has been that we're moving from.
Where's your trouble point? Like in any text that we've been dealing with, like what is it? We're not talking about appropriating some fact. We're always talking about integrating it back into a personal voice. So where's the real nub of your concern?
That the individual and the text are both speaking, I take as given. The question is how the individual is listening. And
Is listening to the text.
Is listening to the text. I certainly find people out there who are engaged with text, and it is, even if it isn't literalism, it's still subjecting oneself to the text.
Right, let me give a personal example. It takes us back to the Chavruat Shalom. When we first were part of Chavruat Shalom, I already had a job. I was teaching at Brandeis. And there were two experiences that clashed that fundamentally shaped me, although I didn't realize it at the moment. Okay? So the first moment, this is right, 1969, I was beginning to teach Bible at Brandeis, and I had all my philological tools very sharp. And I was teaching a course in Bereshit. And then I realized a month into the course, I had only talked about Enuma Elish, and I hadn't said one word about the text because I was trying to approach the text in objective, historical, philological terms, and I could only get those terms and those imagery if I had done this. And I never got to the text because it was this objectified object that had to be precisely interpreted through objective categories, and I never got there. And I was shocked 1 month into it, I hadn't said a word about the biblical text. That was on the one side. That same year, I was teaching, I think, some course in Tehillim at Chavruat Shalom. So I'm beginning to teach one of the Mizmorim, and a couple of the people got up from the table and they lay down on the floor.
I remember this incident, yeah.
And they were grooving, as we used to say, right? It was all subjective. They were moving, or some of them got up and they started to move. You remember those? They were moving.
I remember mostly how upset you were.
Yeah. So so I saw one's going like this, as like he's doing some kind of a dervish twirl as I'm talking, and the other one, I won't mention names, is down there, and it was, and I didn't even know what I was saying that was doing all of this.
Isn't it terrible? We're all just sitting here. We should be on the floor.
Yeah. And I realized that this had gone to the other side. The text was only a pretext for feelings. And it took me a long, all right. So it took me a long while to figure out how to do both and hold the two together. So I'm sharpening that issue. It obviously can be answered in more simple terms, but I lived through both of that because at some level I respected both, but there has to be a real way of bringing it together, and there's no final answer, right? It's not as if there's the text there and then there's the subjective feeling there, or you subject yourself to the text, or you allow the text to give a kind of objective valence. It's very, very dynamic, and there has to be respect going back and forth in both directions. Otherwise, you're not interpreting the text, and you're not allowing your own personal reading to have an impact. Anyway, that's but that shaped me very much. It took me a long while to figure out authenticity of scholarship that would allow the personal voice, and authenticity of personal theology that could use these texts in a very respectful manner. They make a claim upon you that I didn't inaugurate the discourse. It comes to me through a tradition that's starting the discussion, right? So it took me a while, and I'm still in the middle of that, but it took me a long while, and it's a life process. I think you're hitting this, but I don't think there's no simple algorithm, at least in terms of the framework that we're concerned with. There's no algorithm, right? It's not as if you're starting from this Lithuanian model where you said, all right, so there is something that's come down, now that becomes the objectified precedent, and then I have another objectified precedent, and how I bring the two together, and what does this Rishon say to that Rishon, and then how do I make a meta-conceptual thing to bring that, because I'm dealing, as it were, with a series of objective problematics. I think it's much more dynamic, it's much more personal, it's a living avoda. It's a living avoda. And you can only model it, learn it through your teachers, and then model it for your community.
We're very, as you can imagine, we're very close in all this. I don't have an answer for you, but I think you're asking a good question, which is to say, how much freedom should you take? How much should you allow yourself to remake the text? And how much are you a vessel for the text itself to speak through you to your community, to your Jews? And the answer is you'll have to feel that out each time and over the course of time. You have to ask, what am I here for? I'm a rabbi of this community, but Shuk is one of the few people here who has a full-time rabbinic job while he's being in rabbinical school. So I'm a rabbi for this community. What's that job? Part of that job is l'karvam la Torah. You know, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to make Torah important in their lives and help them love it. Or you're trying to give them a glimpse into your love for it, and to help them and allow them to participate in that somehow through you. So that means that you have to read Torah in a way that's going to attract them, it's going to pull them toward that, and that's okay. I think you should be doing that. But you have to say, so is this still Torah that I'm mikarev otam to? Or is it really just, is the Torah just an excuse and I'm bringing them to